Nurses, the untold story of American nurses dropped on Bataan by the Japanese. This is the cover of our book. Summary of the book. Its main idea. This is a gripping book. Elizabeth Norman presents a war story in which the main characters never kill one of the enemy, or even shoot at him, but are nevertheless heroes. First on Bataan, then moved to Corridor. They were under almost constant shell fire, but always hungry, close to starvation, had horrendous disease to deal with despite a shortage, or even a complete lack of property medicine. Getting little or no sleep, nothing in the way of creation, yet they were a true band of angels, inspiring all the men whom they were there to help. In a squalid prison camp, they remaining giants despite their small size. They were the bravest of the brave, who endure unspeakable pain and torture. Americans today should thank God we had such food. Chapter 1. Waking Up to War. Summary. They were mostly daughters of farmers and blue-collar workers. Not having a option, the USA having just gone through the Great Depression, they decide US military as nurses. Assigned to the Philippines, they were having the time of their lives with very little work to do and lots of handsome military men. Americans, of course, who invite them to dinners, dancing, and parties. The country was a tropical paradise. Them, especially to them, is then colonial masters. Chapter 2. Manila cannot hold. Apparently, their military counterparts in the mainland, including those at Pearl Harbor, were having the same laid-back lives and fun nights. Most of them were still asleep when the Japanese planes and submarines blasted their parked planes and shipped to mysteries. The U.S. military was scripted. Within hours, the Japanese promptly bombed the American military installation in the Philippines. Despite the Pearl Harbor hours before, the fighting Americans were still fought with their pants down, so they were almost left without enough planes and ships to repulse of Japanese invasion they long knew was coming. Chapter 3. Jungle Hospital. Suddenly, the American nurses, around 100 of them, found themselves at war. Goodbye to the fancy dinner dates, the dancing and the romance. Here come the mangled, bleeding bodies of their dying and wounded soldiers. They started real work for the first time since the overseas assignment. Chapter 4. The Sick, the Wounded, the Work of War. The original plan of their Supreme Commander General Douglas MacArthur was to defend the country at various possible key points of a Japanese land invasion. But since they were caught napping, they wouldn't do that anymore, not without their planes and ships. So General MacArthur declared Manila, the country's capital, an open city and ordered a retreat of all forces under his command, both Americans and Filipinos, to Bataan, a peninsula in Luzon, and the nearby island fortress of Corridor. Much needed provision, food, medicine, etc. were left during his nasty strategic retreat and consolidation. Chapter 5. Waiting for the help that never came. In the Bataan, the nurses continued their work. They set up field hospitals, mostly just beds where the sick and the injured lay. Many right there on the ground under the canopy of tree forest vegetation. It didn't take long for them to fill the acute shortage of both food and medicine. Chapter 6. There must be no thought of surrender. The nurses and soldiers were in the field while the Chief General MacArthur stayed in his logout, so they nicknamed him Logout Dog. He receives order from the U.S. President not to surrender, but when the situation was already critical, Logout Dog decided to leave his logout and flee to Australia. Then he went home to America. That, after making a speech with the Filipinos and his gullible men, held to 40 years as your return. Chapter 7. Bataan Falls. The wounded are left in their beds. Feeling orphaned, the American soldiers left behind in Bataan called themselves the battling bastard of Bataan. With no mama and no pop, they say. With no reinforcement, no air covers, no ship, no submarines, and fresh supplies, they fought on with Filipino soldiers who greatly outnumbered them and who did not most of the fighting in the front lines. The Filipino also, of course, outnumbered them in the number of dead and injured. Yet, not one name of a Filipino soldier is mentioned in this book. Chapter 8, Corridor, the Last Man. They were, of course, also many Filipino nurses working for the Americans at Bataan. When Bataan was about to surrender, a high-rank American officer ordered the evacuation of American nurses to the nearby corridor. American nurses only. Luckily, the American head nurse, Josie Nesbitt, had grown attached to their Filipino nurses who called her Mama Josie, and she stood her ground, insists that even the Filipino nurses should be given refuge of corridor or else she herself won't go. The officer relented. Not one of these Filipino nurses' name, however, was mentioned in this book too. Chapter 9, A Handful Go Home. Names of a Filipino woman were mentioned, but only those who were married to Americans. The author carefully pointing out their married name and those of their prospective husband.
Chapter 10, An Enemy Hands. From the safety of their office in U.S., General MacArthur and the U.S. President sent to the Philippines a lot of words helping is coming. They kept up saying none came. Even General MacArthur's promise to return took 3 years to fulfill because unknown Filipinos and Americans in the Philippines, the U.S. government has decided to concentrate first in liberating Europe, where the British and the French where Asian was less important. Chapter 11, Santo Tomas. Manila was the second most devastated city. During World War II, and to think that no fighting was done here during Japanese invasion. Why? Because to save on American lives, the American liberator just bombed the city to Rapides. Many Filipino civilians died of these friendly bombs during the liberation of the city. Chapter 12, STIC, the first year, 1940. When both Bataan and Corregidor had fallen, the American nurses were interred at the compound of Alma Mater, the University of the Santo Tomas in Manila, older than Harvard, thereafter called as the Santo Tomas Internment Camp, STIC, that was where the non-combatants enemy citizens were kept by the Japanese. Professional businessmen, women, and children. Food was short in good numbers. Died of malnutrition, starvation, and sickness, but it was no Nazi concentration camp or a Russian gulag. They are the STIC when hungry, but no a hungry as the Filipinos and the rest of the country. They had their deaths, but no frequent and not as many else. Not one of the American nurses died, whether in Bataan, Corregidor, or the STIC. Chapter 13, Las Bañas, 1943. But of course not, the STIC where the American were. No bomb fell on it. Even if it was a key of Japanese garrison, a more expensive, careful plan combined type of operation was done here, barely till firefight happened to free the camp. The surprised Japanese soldiers guarding it was allowed to join the rest of their force only after a brief standoff. Chapter 14: Eating Wheat Fried and Cold Cream, 1942. I took off undergraduate course at the UST, and 4 years I spent long hours at it all. Hispanic era main building where the main library was housed. I already knew them the campus, especially this building, was occupied by the Japanese during war, yet didn't know the reason it was spared from destruction was not because of the prayers of the Dominican priests there, but the presence of the American prisoner during the liberation of the city. Chapter 15: At the fates came crashing down. Despite despite my complaints, however, I felt the need to read this properly. This is a well written, despite the spelling errors of many Filipino words, interesting and truly enjoyable book of history. The pictures are also worth looking at the UST main building. The same at East today. The UST athletic ground where I used to play baseball with the American soldier firing Moscars, the beautiful American nurses, Mary Rose Harrington and Cassie Kashini in their old age, the other in their 70s and 80s, visiting the tombstone of those other nurses who had died ahead of them. Chapter 16: Home Were Really Home. Now picture in your mind 12,000 American soldiers on a forced march on the island of Bataan. We were already near death from starvation, wounds, hydration, and torture. The purpose of the march was to have less prisoners to guard. When they reached the prison camp, many were dead, and the rest were very close to dying. No picture less than a dozen nurses, with no supplies, no medicine, no beds, no water, treating the survivors and responsible for the saving of the most of the survivors. These were the some of the women who are written about in this book. Chapter 17: Aftermath. Have you heard Have you heard of the island of Corregidor? Think of the American nurses and tunnels with little air of light or supplies, operating on soldiers hiding from the enemy and treating men with heroic wounds all day, every day, for months until were discovered and imprisoned. These are the story of unsung heroes of World War II in the South Pacific. As a daughter of a woman who joined the Navy and became a wave shortly after the legislation of sign establishing of waves, was very touched by this book. Chapter 18: Acrostic. As a resident of West Virginia at the time I read it, I was surprised that one of these women was native of Spencer, West Virginia. I know to history as called. Ruby Bradley, U.S. Army, had heard that just a few years ago. Cole Bradley had received 34 medals, had been action in World War II, been a prisoner of war, and tended of wounded in Korea. She was the most highly decorated female veteran, and she was a small example of the caliber woman who survived the hell that was Santa Tomas prison camp.
Mention at least one memorable aspect of the book so that the class will remember something distinctive about your book. The first unit of American women ever sent into the middle of the battle and became the only group of American women captured and imprisoned the Japanese. External criticism. Who was the author? Not merely what was his or her name, but what was his personality, character, position, and so forth. She is Elizabeth Norman, a professor in St. Hard School of Culture, Development and Education, where she teaches history, writing, and research design in the Department of Humanities and Social Science. She is the daughter of two World War veterans. Her father served with the U.S. Army in Europe in 1944. Her mother was in uniform with the U.S. Beth began her personal career as a registered nurse before turning to the study of history and writing. 2. What were her general qualifications as a reporter? Alertness, character bias. Elizabeth M. Norman brings a quiet, scholarly voice to his narrative. In just a little over 6 months, this woman had turned from plucky young girl on a mild adventure to Atlantic heroes. Every page of his history is fascinating. Caroline C., The Washington Post. 3. What were her special qualification and disqualification as a reporter? In the fall of 1941, the Philippines was a gardenia-scented paradise for the American Army and Navy nurses stationed there. War was a distant humor, life a routine of easy shifts and dinner under the stars. On December 8, all that changed as Japanese bombs began raining down on an American bases in the sun, and this paradise became a fiery hell. Caught in the raging battle, the nurse set up field hospitals in the jungle of Bataan and the tunnels of Corregidor, where they tended to the most devastating injuries of war and suffered the terrors of shell entrapment. But the worst was yet to come. After Bataan and Corregidor fell, the nurses were herded into internment camp where they would endure 3 years of fear, brutality, and starvation. Once liberated, they returned to the America that at first celebrated them. But after they refused to honor their leader with the medals they clearly deserved. Here in letters, diaries, remaining firsthand account and the story of what really happened during those dark days, woven together in a deeply affecting saga of women in war. How was she interested in the event related? For the first 4 months of 1942, U.S., Filipino, and Japanese soldiers fought. What was America's first major land battle of World War II? The battle for the tiny Philippine peninsula of Bataan. It ended with the surrender of 76,000 Filipinos and Americans, the single largest defeat in American military history. How was she situated for observation of the facts? The defeat, though, was only the beginning, as a Michael and Elizabeth M. Norman make dramatically clear in this powerful original book, from the until Japanese surrendered in August 1945. The prisoner of war suffered an ordeal or unparalleled, and savagery, 41 months of captivity, starvation rations, dehydrations, hard labor, deadly disease, and torture, far from the machination of General Douglas MacArthur. Had she the necessary general and technical knowledge for learning and reporting the event. The Norman bring to the story remarkable feat of reportage and literary empathy. Their protagonist, Ben Steele, is a figure out of Hemingway, a young cowboy turned sketch artist from Montana who joined the army to see the war. Juxtaposed against Steele's story and the sobering tale of the death march and its aftermath in the story of a number of Japanese soldiers. How soon after the event is the document's written? For on purpose, the century of composition may be sufficiently for another the very hour may be essential. In the bond of angel, letters, diary entries, and face-to-face interview bring the life story an army nurse serving in military field hospital in the jungle of Bataan and the tunnels of Corregidor. After the fall of the island, the nurses were interned in prisoner of war camp, where they spent 3 years enduring brutality and starvation. Despite the initial celebration at their safe return, U.S. neither failed to provide formal recognition of their incredible contribution to the war effort until years later. Weapon of Angel is an overdue tribute to the heroism of the military nurses. How was the document written from memory, after consultation with others, after checking the facts, or by the combining earlier diagrams? A primary source is a document or physically object which was written or created during the time under study. These sources were present during an experience or time period and offer an inside view of a particular event. A primary source is a document or physical object which was written or created during the understudy. These sources were present during an experience or time period offer an inside view of a particular. How is the documents related to others' documents? The presence of documents help track of all aspects of an application and improves on the quality of a software product. It means focuses our development, maintenance, and knowledge transfer to other development.
A. Is it the original source wholly or in part? It is always advisable to have the experiment repeated as many times as possible, and the result to be taken together to get the best possible general interpretation. B. If the letter, what parts of the original but borrowed, whence how incredible are borrowed done? The instrument must be in good working condition to assure reading are accurate and reliable. How and know accurately is the borrowing done? The materials or object are a specimen use must be excellent or at least the best available to the class and kind representative of needed individual or group. How is the borrowed material changed? How used? The experiment has to exercise all care and precaution, not only in settings of the correct instrument but also in the time in reading results. Original criticism. Who was the author? Eyewitness or second-hand account? Norman Elizabeth M. 1999. Eyewitness. Number 2. Why was it written? Her inspiration to write about military nurses came from her experiences as a nurse as well as the fact that both her mother and husband have served in the U.S. military. Number 3. Is the connection between him or her and the documents a natural and plausible one? As an author, Norman has made significant contribution to the field of women's military history. Her work bring to light an often neglected experience of women during wartime. Her first book, Women at Max, examines and previously untold experience of 50 women who served as nurses during the Vietnam War. Her second book, The Band of Angels, is based on interviews with female nurses who were held captive by the Japanese for 3 years in Bataan, Philippines during World War II. Norman was the first to speak to this women, known as the Angel of Bataan, about the tragedy of endurance. She deserves the experience of conducting these interviews. As a woman talking candidly about women, swept up the lethal interpret of men. Her third book, Tears in the Darkness, is a history of Bataan Death March and the American, Filipino, and Japanese combatants who were involved. Would he and she have been in the place and dedicated at the same indicated? No, because she was forward of the book. Was the information given in the document original with him, her, or did the copy it from someone else? Author and researcher Elizabeth M. Norman will recount the bravery of American Army and Navy nurses during World War II in a lecture at the University of Indianapolis, November 13. The discussion, "The Band of the Angels, Untold Story of the American Nurses Trapped on the Bataan by the Japanese," is a part of the University Pension Lecture series and is scheduled for 5 p.m. November 13 at the Switzer Student Center. Registration is encouraged but not required to admission is free. The event is part of the university year-long in celebration of 60 years of nursing at the University of Indianapolis. The university honors and celebrates all veterans or we observe Veterans Day.